Thank you, Garland.
A naval dispute continues between the U.S. and Iran as the Persian state retaliates for the seizure of oil in a Greek tanker. Also, the EU has extended sanctions against Syria for another year. Joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history at the University of Houston, Texas. He's an author of many books and a historian. Dr. Horne, welcome back to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
When the U.S. Energy Information Agency released its latest report last week, commodities traders in the U.S. were quite surprised by one of the statistics given, which included Iranian crude oil for the first time in decades. The U.S. government statistics and court documents show the U.S. has sold about 2 million barrels in Iranian crude after seizing an oil tanker off the coast of the United Arab Emirates. It seems now there has been retaliatory action taken. Dr. Horne, your thoughts on this?
Well, according to press reports, this oil that was seized by the U.S. authorities, which Iran describes as, quote, piracy, unquote, was disposed of not far from where I am sitting. That is to say, in the port of Galveston and the port of Houston. Now, this is obviously quite curious. I think it bespeaks the deteriorating relationship between Iran and the United States of America, a deteriorating relationship that has grown of maximum concern to the so-called European allies. You may have seen the piece written by the Swedish diplomat Carl Bildt and Javier Solana, a former top EU foreign policy official, wondering what's happened to Mr. Biden and pledges they thought they heard during the 2020 campaign to re-enter the Joint Comprehensive Agreement with regard to negotiations concerning Iran's nuclear program. I think it is of concern, and I think it has a lot to do with the growing shift to the right, I'm afraid to say, of the Biden administration, a shift to the right which you see reflected most dramatically with regard to this recent announcement announced in the New York Times just today, that the United States would be sending heavy weaponry to Ukraine. Supposedly, Mr. Zelensky and Kiev have made a promise that it won't be used to attack Russia, but you don't have to be an oracle or a seer to figure out that Mr. Zelensky may decide that that's precisely what he will do with this heavy weaponry, because it will serve to draw the United States and Russia directly into this conflict and will help to relieve Mr. Zelensky of the responsibility for fighting Ukraine fighting Russia to the last Ukrainian. And so this is a deteriorating situation, and it also reflects the fact that Iran itself is growing ever closer to Russia. Indeed, you can see a kind of domino theory working itself out with regard to U.S. foreign policy. You recall the domino theory from the war in Indochina some decades ago, where the idea was the United States had to defeat Vietnam, otherwise they'd be fighting communists in San Francisco. Well, now the idea is that Russia has to be defeated because that's linked to Iran being subjugated, and that leads to the big enchilada, which is the People's Republic of China. And recall in that context, Mr. Biden's recent visit to Northeast Asia, where he sought to knock together a strengthened alliance, an armored alliance against Russia. At the same time, he was in the vicinity. As we've said on this program before, there were joint military exercises between Russia and China involving bombers of both nations flying in the vicinity of Mr. Biden's remarks. Russia and China said this was a coincidence. Others are not so sure. And in any case, Iran has become ever closer to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. As the name suggests, it's in a sense headed by China, although Russia is a close number two. And so you see that RIC, Russia, Iran, China, is becoming a prime antagonist of U.S. imperialism. The problem for U.S. imperialism is, as noted, the European allies are becoming rather wobbly wobbly with regard to continuing this confrontation, look at the Wall Street Journal this morning on the front page. France and Germany becoming ever more nervous about this crisis in Ukraine, and where Washington is leading the European Union. The problem for France and Germany, I'm afraid to say, is that they should have acted months before to head off this controversy, and it will be a stain forevermore that they did not.
Greek authorities impounded Iranian flag tanker. The United States confiscates the oil. Then we have Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov saying, of course, these processes in the world are at a turning point. The formation of a multipolar world is underway, and our Western colleagues are trying to prevent these processes. They want to maintain and extend their dominance to all regions. He wasn't speaking directly about this issue, but it does seem as though his analysis applies to this. Can you talk to that also in the context of the United States seeming to fail time and time again on the international stage in terms of international conflict and trying to, claim the moral high ground when it now seems to be operating like the Barbary pirates?
Barbary pirates, indeed. I think that Mr. Lavrov is onto something. The United States is trying to unscramble the egg. What I mean is that once again, 50 years ago, they made, speaking of U.S. imperialism, an overdetermination of Moscow, in that case the Soviet Union, and they cut this deal with China against the interests of Moscow. And in return, China received massive foreign direct investments that's created this juggernaut. And now the United States is trying to slow down that juggernaut by going after China's closest ally, speaking of Russia, but having China in the crosshairs as well. The problem for U.S. imperialism is that just looking objectively, if you look at these formations that Russia and China are involved in, I mentioned the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I could have mentioned BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, where Argentina is now clamoring to be admitted. So I guess it would become BRICS. And then Mr. Lavrov himself was speaking from a meeting of the Gulf Cooperation Council, which has Saudi Arabia as a chief member. And there has been talk that Saudi Arabia might want to enter BRICS as well. And certainly Saudi Arabia may want to do so because I'm sure you and your audience are familiar with the NOPEC legislation, no to OPEC, in Congress as we speak, which basically suggests that the Saudis don't control their own oil, that it actually belongs to the United States of America, which can tell the Saudis what to do with it. Given the fact that Aramco, the Saudi corporation, is now bigger than Apple and the biggest corporation on planet Earth, this is a major prize to be seized, along with other prizes to be seized, such as the $300 billion in Russian assets that the United States is now frozen. And now there's discussion about seizing those assets, which would be not only contrary to U.S. law as currently written, but also could jeopardize the ability of other countries to safely have investments in the United States of America. But I think that this bespeaks the kind of hysteria that Washington is facing as it sees world hegemony slipping from its grasp with few answers to respond to the rise of China in particular. I'm sure you've seen the stories about the 19 tabletop exercises involving the United States confronting China over Taiwan. In every single tabletop exercise, the United States loses royally to China. And that apparently is not dissuading the United States not only from the kind of buccaneering you've made reference to, but also to a kind of adventurism, an adventurism that seems to inhere and seems to be endemic to U.S. imperialism.
The European Union has extended sanctions against Syria for an additional year. The sanctions include a ban on the import of oil, restrictions on certain investments, and a freeze of the assets of the Central Bank of Syria held in the EU. Putting all those things together, another seizing, more seizing of assets, it seems to me that they are writing their own epitaph, shall we say, and it'll be the empire that died of stupidity by convincing the rest of the world that they were not responsible enough to hold on to the assets of others and keep their contracts. Your thought?
Well, it's not only this thievery, which of course the Afghan authorities and the Venezuelan authorities could also speak to with eloquence, but it's also this attempt to sanction oil from Syria. Keep in mind that sanctioning oil from Russia is a key factor in the surge of inflation, not only in the United States of America, which caused Mr. Biden to have a sit-down with Fed Chairman Jay Powell yesterday, but also with regard to the European Union. And you see that the European Union is scrambling to try to, A, adhere to sanctions without seeming to do so. And so you see Austria, for example, adhering to Moscow's instruction to pay for Russian energy in rubles. And you see that happening with a number of other European Union nations as well. And I think that this is a moment where we should underscore how this will inevitably lead to a rise in importance of African natural resources in terms of natural gas, petroleum, gold, et cetera. If you're not going to deal with Russia, you have to turn south towards Africa. And I hope and I trust that this is high on the agenda of the African-American community. But as I look at what's happening in the Congressional Black Caucus, and I see that House Foreign Affairs Chairman Gregory Meeks of Southeast Queens, a member of good standing of the CBC, has carried legislation calling for sanctions against African nations that do not adhere to the sanctions crusade against Russia, which is not only a slap in the face of African sovereignty, but I dare say that it would also alienate a goodly number of its constituents in Southeast Queens.
Does that also facilitate, and we only have about a minute and a left, does that also just facilitate the turn? The United States lost in Afghanistan and now seems to have turned to Ukraine. As it's losing in Ukraine, it turns to Africa.
And then, of course, as to return full circle, it's also, once again, tightening pressure on Iran. It seems to be flailing and floundering. The problem, of course, is that some of us, including myself and yourselves, are stuck on this ship of fools as it's headed straight to an iceberg.
Thanks you very much. We've been talking with Dr. Gerald Horne, professor of history at the University of Houston, Texas, a historian and author of many books. My favorite is called Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. That's a great book. You can find it online wherever books are sold. I would recommend it. You're listening to The Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon. There's another hour on the other.